Good day, everyone. Our report for today is Transport Policy Analysis and Planning. And under Transport Policy Analysis and Planning, we are going to tackle about first, the nature of transport policy. Second, transport planning and governance. Third, transport safety and security. Fourth, transportation disruption and resilience. Fifth, future transportation system. I will be your first reporter and I will discuss nature of policy. And this will involve first, policy and planning. Second, relevance of transport policy. Third, policy instruments. Fourth, policy development. Fifth, changing nature of policy intervention. And sixth, logistic policy. So I would like to start off by clearing out the difference between transport policy and transport planning. Transport policy refers to the decision made on where to allocate transport resources, while transport planning refers to its effective implementation. And I will explain this further later on. Okay, let's start with the first subtopic. Number 1, policy and planning. So usually, yung policy and planning na pagpapalit na parang synonym sila. Pero pag ginawa natin yon, masyado siyang misleading or parang false information. Ang policy and planning kasi, separate part siya ng isang process ng pagpapa-improve ng situation. Pero there are instances that we can have policy kahit di naman ma-involved ang planning. And planning, more often than not, di ba ginagawa din natin to outside policy context. Okay, let's further define policy and planning. Okay, when we say transport planning, ito yung mga concrete moves na i-implement para sa mga problema na i-encounter sa transportation system. Sa planning, madalang yung gagawa ka ng law, more on achieving goals. Madalas, sumusunod ito sa framework ng policy. Kumbaga, kung ano yung laws and regulation ng policy, naka-align dun yung plano. Okay, when we say transport policy naman, it is the ideals and proposition. Kumbaga, ito yung mga written course of action regarding sa specific objectives that you can see there in the PowerPoint. Madalas involved dito yung government kasi sobrang laki ng responsibility and ownership ng government sa transport system kasi they are public servants at sila yung nagre-regulate ng rules. Pero di naman ibig sabihin nun na hindi nakasali dito yung private sectors. It's just varying talaga, especially geographically. For example, sa US, may history talaga sila na dependent yung transport system nila sa private sectors. While if we are gonna consider Europe, China, India, and Japan, mas malaki yung reliance sa public ownership and operation. So, ideally, if we are going to ask kung paano ba dapat yung standard allocation ng transport policy between private and public sector, si private sector ang dapat nagpro-provide and nag-ooperate ng mga modes of transportation and terminals, while si public sector naman ang nagpro-provide na infrastructure gaya ng highways, bridges, at regulatory frameworks like laws and licenses. Now let's talk about public policy. This is the government trying to relate social, political, economic, and environmental goals sa reality. Kung paano ba yung transport system natin ay makakatulong sa mga goals na kakabanggit ko nga lang. Ang public policy ay pabago-bago dahil nagkakaroon din ito ng innovation and new technology sa ating mundo as time goes by. Next, the relevance of transport policy. Well, obviously, it's very important. Kasi lahat tayo bumibiyahe para sa mga objective natin sa buhay. Like for example, sa aspect of economic, social, and political activities natin. It's important because ang transport ay isa sa malaking issue ng national security. In other words, yung safety nating mga individuals and entities. Ginawa ito para magkaroon ng control sa mga nations and borders, like in our case, sa buong Pilipinas. Kaya nga madaming policies ang na-develop, especially recently because of COVID, to ensure the public health and safety. In our daily lives, ano ba yung mga example ng policy? Well, policies are driver's license, mandatory seatbelt, speed limits, and other accident control. And recently, nagkaroon ng policy concerning the environment tulad ng pagbabawal ng leaded gasoline and reducing carbon emission. In reality, transport policy is developed to avoid monopoly from the private sector of their transport mode, tulad ng cars, buses created by private sector. Kasi pag nagkaroon ng monopoly, maaapektuhan yung welfare of the public in terms of access, availability ng modes of transport, at most of all, yung price. Ano pa yung isang dahilan kung bakit na-develop yung transport policy? Well, para di masakop ng foreign entities ang ating transport system. Pero recently, parang nagbabago na yung pinakadahilan kung bakit tayo nagde-develop ng transport policy. And this is the fourth trend that has significant consequences sa pagdevelop ng modern transport policy. So, first we have globalization, kung saan nakakaapekto ito in terms of dumadami na yung international interactions natin. Tulad ng mga products na imported from other countries and also passengers from other countries. Ano yung effect nito? Ang daming countries with different policies and regulations na involved. So, we are gonna have to deal with these varieties. Next is the regulation and privatization, kung saan na-transfer na sa private sectors yung modes of transportation. In fact, did you know that Philippine Airlines is owned by Lushotan? This is an example na nalilipat na sa private sectors ang mode of transportation. Next is broader focus of policies, particularly yung intermodalism and multimodalism, kung saan nagkakaroon ng two or more mode of transportation from the origin to the destination. This is efficient and more cost-effective, but we also have to focus our policies more on this nowadays. Okay, the last one is a move towards political and social issues, wherein yung mga transport projects natin, instead na focus sa technical and engineering issues, mas nagiging focus na siya sa mga concerns ng public, tulad ng environmental externalities and social issues. But sadly, dahil dito, nagkakaroon ng malaking cost delays and controversies. So third, we have policy instruments. So I am going to discuss some of the most common policy instruments of government. So first, we have public ownership, where the state has direct control of transportation infrastructure, tulad ng roads, ports, airports, and canals, also yung modes of transportation, and yung mga terminals. So, in public ownership, pwede rin ma-include ang operation ng mode of transportation tulad ng airline, railways, at ferries. Okay, next instrument is subsidies. This is when the government provide funds para yung mga services and mode of transportation na masyadong mahal para sa ating karaniwang masses ay maging mas affordable, tulad ng public transit system like trains, buses, and others. Okay, next, regulatory control. Dito naman, the government will influence and choose kung ano ba yung favored shape of transportation, kung saan magsiset up ng public agency para mag-research about transport industry. So they have control on exits and entry of the modes, kung sinong firm ang pwedeng mag-offer ng services and kung anong price and kung kaninong masses. Kaya nga, mahalaga na mabawasan if not matanggal yung monopoly. So another aspect of regulatory control is yung environmental regulation. This is one of the factors when conducting construction, maintenance, and provision and operation in transportation infrastructure. So kahit sometimes the private sector man ang nag-o-offer ng services, malaking factor pa rin ang ating regulations and policy. Kasi if they did something illegal, pwede silang ipastop ni government. So next, we have research and development. Kasi ang standard, si government ang nagpro-promote ng R&D. Nagpro-provide sila ng lab material and funds for R&D, which is important sa transport system. Kasi doon tayo nakaka-discover ng bagong technology. Next, we have labor regulations. Ito naman yung sumasakop sa welfare ng employees. Nagbibigay sila ng trainings and certifications. And this policy affects transport systems significantly in terms of operation costs na nakakatulong sa atin economically. Okay, next, safety and operating standards. This concerns the welfare of the drivers where they have speed limit and limited hours of work. Kasi if overworked yung mga drivers, pwedeng mag-cause ito ng accident and it affects the transport system holistically and worse economically. But policy instrument may have unintended consequences. Like example, taxation saka subsidies. Pwede nitong i-favor ang isang mode of transportation over the other kahit mas efficient naman ang iba. So fourth, we have policy development. So when creating a policy, it must be specified to solve the condition of a certain place and within a specific time frame. Policies are dynamic because our transport system change and new problem may arise over time. So back in 19th centuries, maraming transport system ang dinidevelop and before, sobrang laissez-faire talaga, which means yung private sector ang magpro-provide ng transport services and infrastructure. And some example nito ay turnpike wherein the private sector gets income from toll fees para sa road na ginawa nila. This is a big evidence na nagpro-provide nga ang private sectors ng transport infrastructure noon or sakop pa nila ang sangay na ito noon. Next is canals. Dati raw, karamihan sa mga canals ay nagawa dahil sa funds ng private sector. An example of this is the Bridgewater Canal of Britain. Next is urban transit. Ang isang example nito is North American countries, where public transport system are mostly from private sectors. Next, we have ships. Most maritime shipping companies are privately owned. Ang mga example nito ay Cunard Line in UK, MSC in Switzerland, and Maersk in Denmark. Usually, ang ship ng government ay for military concerns and for transporting passengers and sometimes cargoes only. Okay, next we have railways. They were originally developed by the private company during the 19th century, pero sa North America. Until now, this is still the situation wherein yung private companies ang namamahala sa railway system. But in Europe, nagkaroon ng pagbabawas ng government power. Kaya nagkaroon ng private carriers which caused competition between companies. Pero yung infrastructure is still publicly owned. Actually, yung competition is maganda ito kasi nagkakaroon ng pagbaba ng price and more options para sa ating mga masses. But some countries like North America, kailangan pa rin ng intervention policy kasi there was a time kung saan naglagay ang private sectors ng too much rail lines which caused crisis in the industry. Here are some other informations about this topic. Actually, in the 1930s to 1940s, private bus companies were taken over by municipally controlled commissions. The airline industries in many countries are under ng public sector. For example, Air Force. But in the Philippines, Philippine Airlines is mainly owned by private sector. The nationalization of railway is in the first half of the 20th century occurred in most of Europe as well as in Canada, Russia, China, Japan, and India. Recently, the government owned many segments of private transport sectors and if not, nagpro-provide ang government ng regulations sa mga private sectors. This started noong nagkaroon ng market downfall noong 1930s. Okay, so we are now done discussing policy development. Let's talk about changing the nature of policy intervention. So, even though the trends in the past decades has been towards liberalization and privatization, here are some evidence that public policy intervention is still strong nowadays. We have ownership of ports and airports, where in most countries, terminals are still owned by the state or municipal highway provision. Next is upgrade and maintenance. Until now, malaki pa rin ang budget dito ng government, especially sa Philippines, madalas magpapagawa and mag-a-upgrade ng highways. Next is urban transit system. Madalas, lagi pa rin itong owned ng government. So, merger and acquisition. So, even though yung mga private sectors ay nabibigyan ng chance sa mga services and infrastructure, they will still strictly undergo regulatory approval. So, since we are tackling about changing nature of policy intervention, let me talk more about what they are focusing nowadays. So, now they have more control on environmental and safety concern. Mas focus na din sila sa sustainability. Okay? They also focus on the air quality, especially sa US, since the transport industry is one of the major source of environmental degradation and pollution. Policies are now more environment focused. Okay, they are also more focused on safety in terms of giving speed limits, seat belts, and others na kanilang ini-impose. Okay, so now we will discuss logistic policy. This covers a wide range of activities such as transportation modes, terminal, warehousing, and manufacturing. This challenges the scale, which means it includes global, regional, and local consideration, and scope of transport policy na kailangan pang palawakin at intindihin. Actually, if we are going to choose to improve the logistic activities in our country, here are factors to consider. Cross-sectorial issues, kung saan included ang mga bagay outside ng transport sector. Okay, so now we have transnational actors. Factors of logistics have a lot of transnational presence, which means na kailangan gumawa ng panibagong set of policies for trade and transactions outside of the nation. Okay, so let's also discuss the three main pillars of logistic and public policy interactions. So, first, actors. Sino ba ang nagmamanage ng logistical activities? Operations. Ano ba yung mga logistical activities na kinokonduct? Outcome. Namimit ba ng logistical performance ang standard ng industry? And if there will be generated na problems itong mga questions na ito, there should be regulations or policy made regarding it. Actually, according to transgeography.org, logistics are better if dealt with the private sectors. The government should just be mere supporters and should not provide logistics services kasi nakakaitulong ito na makasali ang private sector sa development ng infrastructure and pag-increase ng economic activities para magkaroon ng commercial and trade flows. Here are some other bases as to why private sector should provide the logistics services. Okay. It improves trade facilitation through simplification, harmonization, and standardization of trade procedure. It also improves the global interface of logistics where nagkakaroon tayo ng access to remote areas and other regions that were actually hard to reach before. It also provides a land base for logistic infrastructure and activities. Kasama na dito yung inland ports and others. It develops human resources in logistics, meaning nakakapagbigay ito ng trabaho and skills sa masses. Next, it supports digitalization, tulad ng freight portals and portal community system which makes logistics more efficient. Next, it develops sustainable niche logistic activities, where you kino-consider dito yung environment and other unique strategy para mapabuti ang ating environment and maging sustainable ang pag-deliver ng mga products. Okay, so next we have improves last mile logistics. First of all, last mile logistics is the final destination. And private sector will help in solving some of the problems regarding dito. Like for example, parking space problems. I just want to say in conclusion to logistic activities, if the government would make logistics a public sector, it may result to creating a new set of governance that focuses on logistics. And that's it for my report. Thank you for listening and goodbye.
Good day, I am Rowella Jean Q. Sumait, and I'm going to discuss the transport planning and governance. Transport planning focuses on the public provision, which include the law enforcement about transportation and financing of transportation assets, particularly roads and public transit systems. It is also required in the operation and management of facilities and services for the modes of transport para ma-achieve yung safer, faster, comfortable, convenient, economical, and environment-friendly movement of people and goods along the highway. Another is, through planning and good governance, may address din ito yung current and future transportation issues, land use, economic development, traffic demand and public safety, also the health and the social needs of people in one community or country. It also shapes how a community or city grows by evaluating everything from streets and highways to cargo ships to public transit and bike lanes. It can influence everything from business to recreation to quality of life. So in here, madidiscuss yung different transport planning and governance na beneficial sa transport system ng bansa. First, ano muna yung purpose ng planning? So nasabi ko na nga kanina na transport planning usually addresses specific problems or broad transport concerns at a local level and has been traditionally a preoccupation of lower tier governments which are the state, the municipal, and the country. Because of this fact, transport planning is most developed in the urban sphere and it is where most experience has been gathered. Sinasabi dito na kalimitan ngang mas nade-develop yung transport planning sa mga urban places kasi doon talaga yung matao, meaning mas maraming klase ng sasakyan. The planning process, however, has several similarities with the policy process, and identifying a problem, seeking options, and implementing the chosen strategy. The common perspective is that planning is the realm of the public sector, although the private sector owns and operates substantial transportation assets. For a long time, planning was field dominated by engineers who gave it a distinctly mechanistic character. So yun nga, mostly engineers na yung nagpropose ng mga plans because sila yung mas may deep understanding about dito dahil nga napag-aaralan at pinag-aaralan nila ito in most crucial and critical way. Therefore, planning process was seen as a series of rigorous steps undertaken to measure likely impacts and propose engineering solution. Before, di ba na-discuss na yung four major steps in standard approach. Ito yung trip generation which predicts the number of trips originating in particular traffic analysis zone, yung trip distribution which displays the number of trips going from each origin to each destination, the modal split which shows the percentage of travelers using a particular mode of transport, and the route selection which involves activities related to the setting of transport networks. They involve the use of mathematical models including regression analysis, entropy maximizing models, and critical path analysis. But there are many reasons why the result of these models should be treated with caution. These are the following. Number one, they are only as good as the data they manipulate, and many times the data is inaccurate or incomplete. Number two, they are based on assumptions that the mathematical relationships between variables remain constant. Number three, they can be manipulated to produce the outcome that would be most preferred by the actors promoting policy or a project. And number four, because the predictions were rarely subjected to subsequent evaluation, their validity is largely questioned, and the modeler is happy to predict the future since projections rarely questions the validity of the methodology. The predictions of future traffic levels produced by the four-stage sequence are then used to identify planning options. But these major approaches sometimes give inappropriate results, since the most common prediction of the modeling is that present capacities will be unable to cope with traffic growth. The tendency has been to produce planning solutions that call for an expansion of capacity. This has been referred to as predict and accommodate. It is the solution that has typified much of the urban transport planning from the 1940s to the 1980s. It has given rise to the enormous expansion of highway construction that reinforces the dominance of the automobile. Rarely, postmortems of the prediction models are undertaken, and as it was learned through empirical observations, the issues of induced demand has distorted the actual traffic. Sinasabi dito na minsan yung predictive analysis, hindi siya 100% na nakakatulong sa mga problems ng transport system kasi yung results na nag-gather through this process are based on mathematical assumption na sinasabi nga na minsan ay pwedeng i-manipulate yung resulta. That is why we have the 2. The contemporary transport planning. It explores skills required for transport planner who wish to improve the economic, environmental, and social performance of urban transport system. Planning is commonly scale-specific and multidimensional. In cities, traffic problems have increased significantly since the 1970s despite a great deal of urban transport planning. There is a growing realization that perhaps planning has failed and that the wrong questions have been asked. Rather than estimate traffic increases and then provide the capacity to meet the expected growth, it is now accepted that what is required is better management of the transport system, particularly maintenance, through new approaches to planning. Just as urban planning requires the inputs of many specialists, transport planning is beginning to utilize multidisciplinary teams to broaden the scope of the planning process. Planning is still a multi-step process, but it has changed considerably as goals and objectives. While the goal of traditional transport policy, improving accessibility, is still useful, it must be considered in the context of other desirable goals. For example, yung pag-improve ng safety and health, yung pagre-reduce ng vehicle emissions, yung pag-improve ng equity, yung pag-enhance ng economic opportunities, and yung pag-improve also ng community livability are all valid, but prioritization of goals results in a very different planning process. Because defining goals becomes a much more complicated stage in contemporary planning. Increasingly, goals have turned to consider managing demand rather than trying to build capacity. And then the options. Given the possible range of goals, the transport planner must consider it becomes necessary to provide a set of possible options. Several objectives may be desirable, and thus it is important to consider what will they imply. Several scenarios may have to be considered, and they must become important components of the planning process. We also have the identification of actors, institutions, and stakeholders. Given that transport planning has the potential to influence so many elements of society, it is important that those affected by the transport problem and its potential resolution should be identified so that they can be engaged. This would be a much broader list of affected parties than merely those involved in the transportation activity itself, and requires recognizing a role for citizen participation. Failure to do so runs the risk of a project to meet significant opposition from stakeholders perceiving that they have been left out or that they can be negatively impacted. Number two, or the next one, is the predicting outcomes, identifying benefits, and assessing costs. The stage of predicting the outcomes for each of the options in a critical step in the process. Models continue to play an important role, but whereas the traditional models were based on the number of trips, increasingly modeling is becoming more activity-based. Transport is seen in the context of scheduling household decision in time and space. Demographic and social data are used extensively, and mathematical models have become more sophisticated. Nevertheless, there are rules for the other types of analysis, including non-objective forecast. The predicted outcomes must be assessed as to their benefit and cost. This may be expressed in monetary terms, but many transport plan situations call for measurement in other terms such as visual impacts, environmental dislocation, and employment impacts. The next one is choosing a course of action. Evaluation of the scenarios must consider the costs and benefits from the frequently conflicting perspectives of the stakeholders and actors. Extensive public consultation may be required. The information must be disseminated and explained so that an informed public can participate in the debate. Ultimately, it will be a politician who will decide, but they are swayed by the strength of the arguments presented by the transport professionals and in publicly contentious cases by pressure brought to bear by the citizens. Number three is the transport demand management. In rejecting the former paradigm of building capacity, transport planners have turned increasingly to manage both demand and the transport system. Building roads has produced a car-oriented society in which the other modal alternatives have little opportunity to coexist. Car ownership is beyond the ability of the transport planner to control directly, and the question remains if this should be the case. But car use and ownerships are affected by land use and density, both elements that planners can affect. High population densities favor walking, bicycling, and public transit use. It is this reason that a great deal of attention in planning is being paid to densification and integration. This includes concentrating development along well-served transport corridors, transit-oriented development, and increasing densities in areas undergoing rehabilitation. Managing the demand for transport is made up of a large number of small interventions that cumulatively can impact car use, but in particular, improve the livability of cities. A sample of well-practiced and successful intervention includes park and ride. Parking spaces are provided usually close to an expressway where drivers can board public transit. Example nito is yung mga buses na nagpro-provide ng service within the city. Next is the traffic calming. Measures that seek to reduce the speed of vehicles in urban areas such as speed bumps and street narrowing. Next is the priority lanes for buses and high occupancy vehicles. Lanes on major thoroughfares and expressways that are reserved for buses, taxis, and passenger vehicles with several occupants. So ito yung lane for mas malalaking sasakyan na kaya mag-occupy ng mas maraming passenger. The goal is to encourage the use of buses and high occupancy vehicles that can be seen to travel at a higher speed along the reserved lanes by other drivers who may be stuck in the traffic jams. Next is alternate work schedules. Encouraging work hours other than the dominant 9 to 5 schedule. One of the most salient problems in transport planning is that demand is concentrated into two main peak periods. Next is promoting bicycle use. It is a green and healthy mode, but in automobile-dependent cities, the bicycle does not share the roads easily with trucks and cars. Encouraging greater use of the bicycle requires significant planning adjustment, such as the provision of bicycle lanes and bike stands. Next is the car sharing. Encouraging drivers to share car use with neighbors or co-workers. Information technologies can enable to extend car sharing schemes to a wider base. Next is enhancing pedestrian areas. In most cities, vehicles dominate the streets. In many areas of high population density, the quality of life, enhanced safety, less pollution, etc., and the visual attractiveness of streetscapes can be enhanced by excluding vehicles from streets altogether or limiting access to public transport vehicles. Next one is improving public transit. For half of a century or more, public transit use has declined in most cities. Yet, it is the only alternatives to the car in these cities, and thus enhancing the use of transit has become a major planning objective. Improvement includes making transit more attractive by improving bus schedule and improving the appearance and comfort of the transit vehicles and station. Example nito yung mga new design buses dito sa Pilipinas, yung may mga maliliit na LED screen sa likod ng upuan na pwedeng maging libangan ng mga passenger. The last one is the parking management, restricting on-street parking and charging higher rates for parking. This also applies to the parking of delivery vehicles, which has become an important issue with the growth of e-commerce and the associated home deliveries. The next one is pricing. To balance transport cost and benefits, efficient pricing is necessary. Through proper and strategic pricing, the goal is to propose alternatives para makalesen sa transport problem. While planning interventions may have a positive cumulative effect in shaping transport demand, some economists suggest that a more direct approach involving imposing more stringent cost measures on car users is necessary. It is widely accepted that car users pay only a small proportion of the actual cost of their vehicle use. Economists argue that users should bear the external cost. As intuitively rational as this argument may be, there are several problems with its application. First, there are difficulties in measuring externalities with considerable variation in estimates between different studies. Sinasabi dito na different types of use, speeds, engines, vehicle weight, and driving conditions, making it more challenging to produce broadly accepted values. Decision makers have difficulty in agreeing to impose charges when there is a diversity of evidence about external cost. Second, there are particular difficulties in collecting this cost. One of the easiest and most widely used method is gasoline tax. It is a crude approach, however, because it is imperfectly distinguishes between driving conditions and engine type. A fuel-efficient vehicle may have just as high consumption in heavy urban traffic as a less efficient vehicle in a rural setting. The growth in the use of alternative fuels such as electricity will further challenge fuel taxes. Third, is the political difficulty of imposing such additional cost on the public. Free access to roads tends to be seen as right, and it is intensely unpopular to propose any new forms of revenue generations that hints at additional taxation. The effectiveness of economic control is evident by the experience of Hong Kong, where, despite high incomes, car ownership and use remain at a very low level. This is mainly due to the high cost of parking. So sa Hong Kong, kahit na mataas yung kita ng mga tao, kakaunti pa rin yung mayroong sariling sasakyan dahil nga sa mataas or mahal na parking fee. So kung iisipin, maganda nga strategy to para malesen yung traffic. Another is, an even more drastic example is in Singapore, where extreme measures limiting car purchases, high vehicle licenses, electronic tolls on highways, and cordon pricing in the downtown area were restrained car use. The use of pricing mechanism may be less in the other countries, but the trend towards the greater application of some forms of tolling is accelerating. We have the cordon pricing in US, which involves charging a fee to enter or drive within a congested area, usually a city center. So, yung sa cordon pricing, hinihingan nila ng fee yung mga sasakyan na dadaan or papasok sa mga masisikip na lugar, especially kapag nasa city proper ka. Another form of charging is the imposition of tolls on new highway and bridges na ginagawa na dito sa Pilipinas. For example, sa NLEX, di ba may tolls doon na binabayaran para makadaan ka. With congestion of fair pricing, certain lanes of a highway are tolled but at variable rates. When traffic is improving freely, the charges for the tolled lanes are nil. But as traffic builds up and speeds are reduced, the cost of using the reserve lanes increase. The collection of the tolls is electronic, and drivers are informed of the current changes by large signs. Drivers are given a choice, therefore, to stay in a slower lanes for free or move to the tolled lanes at a cost that is proportionate to the speed on the congestion. The last one is the governance in transportation. Transport policy and planning require governance, which is associated with the practical usage of existing resources as well as better allocation of new resources. Like all sectors of activity, transportation has a unique set of characteristics about its governance as both the public and the private sectors are actively involved. Governance, on the other hand, concerns the ownership and management of assets and resources to fulfill goals such as profit of welfare through the exercise of authority and institutional resources. It concerns the public as well as the private sectors but tends to apply differently depending on if public or private interests are at stake. In both cases, a significant concerns in performance, which is how effectively available assets are used. The governance of transport infrastructure is particularly relevant because of the strategic, economic, and social importance of transportation and the cross-jurisdictional character of many infrastructures such as highway, rail, and telecommunication networks. Transport is not a mere convenience, but a fundamental infrastructures that must systematically and continuously be available to its user. Effective governance is complex to assess since it is not linked with a specific governance structure but generally conveys several advantages. Number one is the confidence. It provides a level of confidence that an activity such as a terminal or a logistics zone is effectively managed. This can involve daily operations as well as the planning, design, and funding the new infrastructure. Effective governance is linked with consistent and reliable services as well as good level of responsiveness and feedback when an unexpected issue arises. Next is the capital cost, which lowers capital cost as investors and financial institutions have confidence that all allocated capitals will be effectively used in the development and expansion of productive assets generating returns. Next is competitiveness, improves the capability to compete through the retention of existing users and the attraction of new ones. This can take many forms such as lower cost, but factors such as clear expectation and transparency are also significant. Keeping market considerations constant, organizations with better governance are usually able to be more competitive than organizations having less effective governance. Next one is stability. It confers a long-term resilience of the organization, which provides a level of stability in capital markets and the financial institutions supporting them. Many transportation infrastructures have a long lifespan that can be more effectively managed with a stable governance structure. For transport infrastructures such as port terminals, airports, highways, inland ports, or logistic zones, many different forms of governance are in place which shape modes of financing, operations, functioning, and external relationship. This is particularly important as large transport infrastructure involves in global flows of passenger and freight is complex, capital intensive, and of strategic importance to the economic welfare of whole regions. Therefore, the capital intensiveness and the long lifespan of transportation infrastructures underline the need for effective governance to ensure that the infrastructures are adequately funded, maintained, operated, and expanded. There are two main components of transport governance: the ownership and the operation. The first one is the ownership, which involves who is the owner of the terminal site and facilities including equipment. And under ownership, we have the public ownership, which is common because of the economic and strategic importance of many types of terminals. In several jurisdictions, passenger railroads are owned by the national government, and the passenger stations are thus under the control of the state-owned railway company. Also under public ownership, the investment in infrastructure and planning future expansion is carried out by the public authority using public monies or public guarantees for capital borrowed from private markets. The private sector is then offered leasing opportunities in which terms and duration can be negotiated. The next one is the private ownership, which is less evident in transport terminals. In here, private capital is used to provide infrastructure. The second component is the operation, which involves the day-to-day management and carrying out of terminal activities. And under this, we have the public control of operations is typical in many ports, such as Singapore and Hampton Roads. In many state-controlled railroads such as China, and at publicly owned airports such as United States, here are the public authority provides the of handling equipment contracts with the labor force and operates the rail, airports, and port terminals. Next is the private companies that manage and carry out operation in private owned terminals. They are also active as operators in many publicly owned facilities under a concession agreement. The latter is a growth trend in ports and airports where facilities are leased to terminal operation for fixed terms. The type of concession vary considerably in terms of duration and condition. Some are short-term, a few years or so. More typically, they are long-term concession of 15 to 30 years. In some, the owner provides some equipment such as gantry cranes in ports. In others, the concession holders are expected to invest equipment. In some, they are required to use public employees, while in others, they may use their own workers. Here is the graph of the lifespan life cycle of main transport assets. Yung dark blue na color sa graph, ini-specify yung average lifespan which indicates the years kung gaano tatagal magpe-perform under normal operating condition while receiving regular maintenance yung isang transport asset. While yung light blue color naman is ina-specify yung optimum lifespan or yung best condition ng isang transport asset as it undergo various construction materials, techniques used, and operating conditions since higher engineering requirements may further extend lifespan. And among the major transport asset, makikita natin na yung automobile, which is the car, has the shortest lifespan in the range of 8 to 10 years lang, depending on the level of usage and operating environment. However, there is evidence that the lifespan of cars is increasing due to technical improvements. Makita din natin dun sa graph na yung properly maintained jet plane can easily last 20
Good day,
years
I'm
with
Jenny
some
Angelo
lasting
Verdadero. I'm
beyond
here to
30
talk about
years,
transport
ending
safety
their
and
service
security.
life as cargo
So here we
planes.
will have first a new
Kita
context
din
in
natin na
transport
yung rail
security.
lines can
Second,
last for
physical
decades
security
if
of
not a
passengers.
century
And
and a half,
lastly, freight security.
depending on a construction
So
materials
let's
used,
proceed.
but
What
require
is transport
constant
safety
and
and security? Safety and
capital-intensive
security issues
maintenance.
concern both
Transport
transportation modes and
investment
terminals that
must
can be either a
thus
target for
look
terrorism, a
closely
vector to
at the
conduct illegal
expected
activities, and even a
lifespan
form of
of
warfare. So sinasabi lang dito na
infrastructure
yung
to
safety and
ensure a
security daw
proper
concern siya sa mga issues
amortization
na
and
involved yung
match the
transportation modes,
investment time
yung
range
terminals na pwedeng
with the
maging target ng
expected
terrorism,
lifespan of
na
the
karaniwan din
transport asset.
pinagkakondakan ng mga illegal activities,
Public
or kung saan
ownership and
nangyayari yung
operations have been
mga away or
important in
conflict.
many
Hindi
modes
naman bago sa atin
because
kung
of the
gaano kadelikado
strategic
sa kalsada,
importance
terminals,
of
or kahit habang
transport and
bumabiyahe
the
tayo.
long-term
Kahit yung
investment
mga private
required
vehicles na
that the
bibiktima din lalo
private
na
sector
yung
may
mga
be
sumasakay sa mga
incapable
public
or unwilling
transportation. So,
to
aware na
make.
tayo sa ganong
In this
pangyayari,
way,
kaya
the
naman talagang dapat
terminals
bigyang
can be
pansin
owned
kung paano
and
mapapanatili
operated as
yung
public
seguridad.
goods and can be integrated with
So,
public,
number 1, a new context
regional,
in
and
transport
national
security.
economic
While issues
policies.
of safety and
On the other
security have
hand,
preoccupied
public
transport planners
facilities
and
are
managers
seen
for
by
many
some
years,
as slow
it
to
is only
respond to
recently that
market
physical
conditions,
security has become
with
an
a
overriding issue.
propensity
So,
to
before, mas focus sa
overinvest
safety
in
and security,
non-economic
pero recently,
developments
mas
and with
binigyan
high
pansin na
cost
yung
to the
physical
user.
security.
The
Ano nga
default
ba
is
yung physical
commonly to leave the
security? Physical
governance
security, ito yung
structure
protection
the
from
way it
physical
is,
actions na
since
pwedeng mag-cause
inertia
ng serious
is
loss
the
or
usual
damage sa
norm
isang agency
of
or
managing
isang
large
institution.
infrastructure.
Next, under din ng physical
That's
security,
all.
ang
Thank you.
access, which is monitored and controlled and movements are channeled along pathways that provide safe access to and from platforms and gates. Meron din silang access control kung saan gumagamit sila ng mga electronic devices para ma-monitor at ma-control yung galaw o pangyayari sa isang lugar. In the freight industry, security concerns have been directed into two areas, worker safety and theft. When we say freight, ito yung mga products or goods that are transported by ships, aircraft, or motor vehicles. Dito, ang concern dito is yung safety ng mga workers saka yung mga pagnanakaw. The most visible emerging form of security threat is cybersecurity, to which transportation infrastructures and organizations are particularly vulnerable. When we say cybersecurity, ito yung practice of protecting critical systems and sensitive information from digital attacks. Dito pumapasok yung mga IT. Next, meron tayong pie chart. Sa left side yung thefts and then yung right side naman yung locations. Sa thefts, ito yung mga karaniwang ninanakaw katulad ng alcohol, tobacco, metals, clothing or shoes, and etc. Dito naman sa right side yung locations ng kung saan nagaganap yung mga pagnanakaw. So, dito una yung truck stops, public access parking, mga secured parking, and etc. So next, the foundation of transport security includes several dimensions and potential measures. What is dimension? Ito ay concern sa integrity or safety of the passengers or cargo, route, and the information system managing the transport chain. While yung measures naman, ito yung set ng procedures na ini-implement para ma-maintain yung integrity or safety ng mga passengers or cargo by doing inspections and the security of facilities and the personnel as well as of the data in the supporting information systems. Next, the expected outcomes of these measures include, ito naman ay mga self-explanatory na siya. First, nire-reduce niya daw yung risk of travel and trade disruptions in response to security threats. Next, it improves security against theft and diversion of cargo with reductions, indirect losses, cargo and sometimes the vehicle, and indirect costs yung mga higher insurance premium. Also, ini-improve niya rin yung security against illegal transport of passengers and goods, katulad ng mga counterfeits, narcotics, and weapons and of-person. Also, it improved reliance on the information system supporting the complex transaction generated by transport activities. Next, it reduced risk of evasion of duties and taxes. It increases confidence in the international trading system by current and potential shippers of goods. And lastly, it improves screening process, cost, and time, and simpler procedures. Number 2, we have physical security of passengers. So, kanina, dinefine natin yung physical security in general. Dito, yung physical security na for passengers lang. So, dito, physical security, it offers protection to passengers for them to feel safe in the airport. So, large physical barriers display strength and allow passengers to feel protected. Next, Transportation Security Authority or TSA to oversee the imposition of strict new security measures on the industry. Maraming steps ang involved dito. So, for example, sa airport, isa sa sinesecure dito yung facilities, nire-restrict yung pwedeng gumamit, also yung mga compartments, secure din. Tapos nagkakaroon pa sila ng screening para sa mga passengers para malaman kung may dala ba silang deadly weapons or anything na matulis. Nire-restrict din sila sa kung ano lang yung dapat dali nila sa loob ng isang airplane. Also, yung mga luggage, nag-undergo din sila ng screening to know kung may mga laman ba na illegal na bagay katulad ng drugs or etc. So next, the Computer Assisted Passenger Pre-Screening System or CAPPS, it required more personal information from travelers when they book their flights, which is used to provide a risk assessment of each passenger. So dito, nire-require yung passenger to give their personal information para malaman kung may criminal record or para ma-assess rin yung mga tao. So to avoid commotion or any kind of conflict, they have to do this. But in 2004, it was replaced by Secure Flight Program working under the similar principles but entirely managed by TSA. kinancel yung CAPPS dahil nagkaroon ng problem yung mga assessment nila na nagawa na mostly incorrect daw. So, pinalitan ng Secure Flight Program yung CAPPS, which is same principle lang naman sila, pero ang nagmamanage na dito ngayon ay yung Transportation Security Authority or TSA. Next, we can see here a graph representing worldwide attacks inside an aircraft by type from 1970 to 2009. Yung mga attacks are usually hijacks, bomb, cargo bomb, hijack crash, and others. Mapapansin natin na dati mas risky mag-travel dahil syempre, hindi pa ganun kahigpit or wala pang masyadong restrictions. Pero as time passes by, we can see na nag-i-improve yung level of security natin. Nalilesen over time yung attacks, and makikita natin sa chart na by year 2000, almost 82% na yung nabawas compare nung 1970s. So, sa right side naman natin, meron tayo ditong number of yearly fatalities due to air transport crashes from 1918 to 2018. So, dito pinapakita lang kung ilan yung mga namamatay yearly dahil sa pag-crash ng airplano. So, dito makikita natin at the year 1945, dun may naitalang pinakamaraming number of deaths nang dahil sa air transport crash. Next, epidemiological security. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 brought forward a new dimension to passenger transportation security, which is epidemiological security. This is particularly the case for high-density forms of passenger transportation such as public transit, cruise shipping, and air travel. So dahil sa COVID-19, nagkaroon tayo ng pagbabago sa transportation security. Di ba ngayon marami nang hinahanap sa pag-travel like yung mga vaccine cards natin, and sa mga public transportation naman meron ng bilang kung ilan lang yung passengers na pwede nilang isakay. And pagka sasakay ka din ng mga public transportation, kailangan mo ring magsuot ng mga face mask. Number 3, freight security. Security in the freight industry has always been a major problem. Illegal immigrants, drug smuggling, custom duty evasion, piracy, and the deployment of substandard vessels, higher propensity to accidents have been some of the most important concerns. So, ang major problem sa freight industry ay yung theft. We live in the age where yung population is getting bigger and bigger. Yung mga magnanakaw din nag-i-improve. Mga nagiging mas matalino sila, aggressive, at nagiging mapili sa kung ano yung nanakawin nila. Alam na nila ngayon kung ano yung mga products na mataas ang value sa market. Kaya ayun na yung mga tinatarget nila. In light of the emergence of global supply chains, the emphasis on freight transport security is gradually shifting into a more comprehensive but complex approach. When we say global supply chains, ito yung worldwide system na ginagamit ng mga business para makapag-produce ng products na ngayon ay mas pinapatibay ang seguridad upang maiwasan yung mga nasabing problema kanina. Next, in the United States, the response was to enact the MTSA or Maritime Transportation and Security Act in 2002. Ang MTSA, it was put in the law para mapataas yung seguridad ng mga seaports natin. Yung MTSA din ay nagpo-provide ng mga provisions para sa maritime industry to which vessels and port facilities are mandated to adhere. Ito rin yung isang safety program that aims to better identify and deter threats at our ports and sa mga waterways. The basic elements of this legislation were adopted by the International Maritime Organization or IMO as the International Ship and Port Security Code ISPS, which began to be implemented in 2004. Yung IMO, ito yung agency na responsible sa safety and security of shipping at sa pag-prevent sa marine and atmospheric pollution by ships. Next, these are 3 important features of these interventions. Number 1, the requirement of an automated identity system or AIS for all vessels between 300 and 50,000 deadweight tonnage. So, yung mga vessels, nire-require ng AIS to have a permanently marked and visible identity number. And there must be a record maintained of its flag, port of registry, and address of registered owner. Number 2, each port must undertake a security assessment. This involves an assessment of its assets and facilities and an assessment of the effects of damages that might be caused. The port must then evaluate the risk and identify its weaknesses to its physical security, communication systems, and utilities, and etc. So, dito kailangan na-evaluate mo na agad yung mga possible na mangyayari or prepared ka na sa mga possible risk na mangyayari. Number 3, all cargoes destined for the U.S. must receive custom clearance before the departure of the ship. Besides, biometric identification for seafarers was implemented and maintained in national databases. Next, the Certified Cargo Screening Program or CCSP forces airlines, freight forwarders, and shippers to assume the cost of these security measures. In an attempt to establish a secure air freight transport chain, the measure imposed additional costs, delays, and disruptions, undermining the operational effectiveness of air cargo. Still, the air freight industry has adapted to these measures. Security has become an additional element in determining competitive advantage. Yung CCSP kasi, or Certified Cargo Screening Program, it is a voluntary program that is designed to enable trusted and validated industry participants to screen cargo early in the air cargo supply chain. And also, it is designed to establish the integrity of the shipment through enhanced physical and personal security standards at CCSFS. And it is also designed to maintain the integrity of the shipment throughout the supply chain by utilizing stringent chain of custody methods.
Good day everyone, I'm Gerald C. Dizon at ang i-discuss ko sa inyo ngayon is all about transportation, disruptions, and resilience. So yung topic na to is still under transport planning and policy. So bakit nga ba mahalaga na pag-aralan ito? Siyempre, we need to know disruptions and resilience that occurs in a specific area kasi these are the things that we have to consider in transport planning and policy. First, let's define what disruption and resilience mean. Disruption, when we say disruption, it is the disturbance or problems which interrupt an event, activity, or process. So, examples of disruptions are natural disasters or human-made disasters. When we talk about resilience naman, it's the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. So, first, let's start with transportation and national security. Transportation systems are designed to operate under defined conditions. Yet, disruptions such as those caused by accident or by a storm are rather frequent and well mitigated. On occasion, a disruption at a much larger scale takes place to the extent that the safety or security of a whole region or nation is compromised. So in the national scales, disruptions can be devastating in different aspects. And also, marami ding mga national activities hindi man directly nagkakos ng mga disruptions pero mas nakakalala pa sa level of threats and risks ng mga disasters na pwedeng dumating. So, ito nga yung tinatawag nating drivers. These are four drivers that have an impact on the threats and risk level of disasters on transportation systems. So, first, increased mobility. When we say mobility, it is the ability to move or be moved freely and easily. So, dahil nga sa high technology ngayon, lahat ng galaw ng tao in terms of transportation ay matulin na at madali na. The good side is mapapadali yung pag-transport ng mga goods ng tao, especially for commuting, tourism, business, and migration. Pero the bad side of it is mas nagiging prone yung mga lugar sa mga disruptions, specifically yung mga katulad ng diseases or kaya viruses. Kung mas mapapadali yung pag-travel ng mga tao, pag-transport ng mga goods, syempre mas mapapadali din yung mga possible viruses or diseases na kumalat. So, katulad nga ng pandemic ngayon, di ba? Dahil sa high technology, matuloy na nakakarating yung ibang tao sa ibang bansa, nasabay na may virus sa isang lugar, matulin din na lumipat sa isang bansa yung naging virus. So, that's the bad effect of increased mobility. Second, we have urbanization. Di ba? Very obvious naman na ang urbanization, merong good side pero mostly bad side. So, ano ba yung ibig sabihin ng urbanization? The emergence of large cities has led to acute concentrations of populations, a pattern significantly different than the more dispersed settlements that prevailed in rural societies. So, di ba pag urbanization, yung mga tao, mas pinipili na or mas dumadayo na yung tao sa cities, which means nagkakaroon ng overpopulation, nagiging condensed, and that means maraming mga problems na pwede mag-occur katulad sa natural, sa environment, and syempre sa social and health ng tao. So, yung urbanization, nakaka-apekto din siya or nakakadagdag din siya ng threats or risk ng disasters na pwedeng maka-apekto sa transportation system. We also have centralization and concentration of distribution. So, etong centralization and concentration, di ba may mga unequal distribution ng assets katulad dito sa atin, sa bansa natin. Di ba ang halos lahat ng transportation system na high-tech ay nasa Manila lang. So, syempre, kung doon lang yun, medyo makaka-apekto yun sa sa iba't ibang aspeto. Tapos, pwede din siyang makadagdag ng risk or threat doon sa disruption na pwedeng dumating sa ibang lugar. And lastly, we have infrastructure and economic interdependency. So, technically, yung infrastructure and economic are interdependent to each other. Meaning, nakadepende yung isa sa isa. Katulad ng example is, kapag nasira yung isang infrastructure, especially kapag mga major infrastructure sa isang lugar, maraming naapektuhan. And it directly affects the economy of a certain place. So, kung nasira man yung isang infrastructure, magiging domino effect yan. Pwedeng makaapekto sa economy. Kapag nakaapekto sa economy, matatamaan din yung iba't ibang aspeto ng isang lugar. So, ano nga ba yung mga major issues of national security na mangyayari or maapektuhan ng mga disruptions? First, we have the transportation supply. Siyempre, kapag yung mga transportation supply, yung mga deployment of troops, emergency relief, kapag tinamaan ng disruption yung transportation system natin, siyempre, mawawala yon or babagal. Next, we have transportation readiness. Kapag nagkaroon ng isang disaster at tinamaan ng isang transportation system, syempre, mababawasan yung readiness natin at mababawasan yung pagiging active, readiness, and productivity ng isang transportation infrastructure. Also, we have transportation vulnerability. Kapag tinamaan na ng isang disruption ang isang transportation system, magiging vulnerable na siya sa iba't ibang harm, accidents, and other natural events. Also, and lastly, illegal use of transportation. Kapag yung isang transportation system is naapektuhan ng isang disruption or disaster, pwedeng itong gamitin sa illegal use, especially or specifically like transporting of illegal goods like drugs, endangered species, and also illegal immigration. And now let's talk about potential threats and risks. The disruptions caused by disasters take place over complex transportation systems and are consequently difficult to evaluate. So when we say risks or threats, it is a situation involving exposure to danger. So ano nga ba yung mga bagay na mag-expose sa atin, sa tao, or sa mga infrastructure sa panganib? We subdivided disasters into two. The first one is the natural disaster. When we say natural disaster, it is naturally occurring in the environment that can massively damage infrastructure. The first natural disaster is this extreme weather event. When we say extreme weather event, it is not simply about the weather. It is extreme weather event. The examples are such as floods, cyclones, tornadoes, and droughts, or any disastrous events. So, So, hindi nito pinag-uusapan yung konting ulan lang. Dahil yung ulan or ambon, hindi naman nakaka-apekto massively dun sa mga transportation system. Ang pinag-uusapan dito is baha or bagyo. Next, the second natural disaster is geophysical. When we say geophysical, it is the tectonic activity or the movement of the tectonic plates. The example of this is earthquakes. So, kapag may mga earthquakes na nangyayari, di ba, talagang naapektuhan yung mga transportation system, especially yung mga roads, yung mga buildings. Next, we have geomagnetic storms. It is a temporary disturbance of the Earth's magnetosphere caused by a solar wind shock or cloud of magnetic field that interacts with the Earth's magnetic field. The last one is the sea level rise, which is obviously na talagang makaka-apekto doon sa mga transportation infrastructure, especially doon sa mga isolated areas na malapit doon sa dagat. The second type of disaster is anthropogenic disaster. This is artificial or is resulted from human activities. It can be intentional or unintentional. The first anthropogenic disaster is accident. So, obviously, kapag may mga accidents na nangyayari sa mga transportation infrastructures, naapektuhan, nasisira yung mga infrastructures. Katulad, kunyari, nabangga yung isang kotse, tapos tinamaan yung mga barriers dun sa kalsada, di ba, nasisira, nagkakaroon ng mga disturbances, especially dun sa ibang mga commuters. The second one is infrastructure failure. Kapag nag-fail yung isang infrastructure, specifically transportation infrastructure, naapektuhan din syempre yung ibang infrastructure. The next one is the conflicts, terrorism, and piracy. Ang isang example nito is the Marawi Siege. 'Di ba, Marawi Siege is obviously a terrorism. So nung nagkaroon ng sigalot doon sa Marawi, nagkaroon ng laban sa pagitan ng mga sundalo sa mga terorista. Ngayon nagpalitan ng mga baril, syempre mga nagkaputukan, naapektuhan yung mga kalsada, nasira, yung mga barriers, yung mga signage. So talaga nakakaapekto yung terrorism sa infrastructure system. The next one is economic and political shocks. So, ito naman, pinag-uusapan dito is the staggering amount of debt na pwedeng makuha ng isang bansa. So, syempre, kapag masyado ng malaki yung debt or yung utang mo, magiging limitado yung capacity mo to maintain or create more transport system, which means it can be damaging or disruptive. The last one is pandemic. So, pandemic, it does not directly affect transportation system. Pero, some of the effects are, kunwari na lang is isa-shutdown yung mga airports or kaya nako-compromise yung transportation of medical supplies and food. Next, pag-usapan naman natin transportation disaster planning. Although a potential disaster can never be effectively planned and even anticipated in some instances, there are a series of steps known as disaster risk management. So obviously, hindi naman natin kayang maplano ng effectively or mahulaan kung kailan nga ba or gaano ka lakas at kung saan tatama yung mga disasters na pwedeng mangyari. So meron tayong tinatawag na disaster risk management. The first step in disaster risk management is risk assessment. The likelihood of an event and its potential impact should be comprehensively assessed. Examples of assessment are knowing the probability if it's low or high risk, and as well as the specific time frame or specific area na pwedeng tamaan ng disaster. The second step is preparedness or pagiging handa. In light of the potential risk, a level of preparedness should be considered in terms of potential responses. So, ano yung mga bagay na pwede natin gawin upang maghanda sa papadating na disasters? Pwedeng gawin warehousing, pwedeng ihanda yung mga relief materials such as foods, fuels, equipment, and also yung pagtitrain doon sa mga labor force in case of emergency situations. Third step, mitigation. When we talk about mitigation, it is also referred to as last minute preparation. Ito yung mga pwedeng gawin last minute bago dumating yung disaster. It can involve the shutting down of transport systems, the evacuation of populations, and the mobilization of first response resources, or yung pagdidistribute ng mga emergency relief such as food and medical supplies. Yung mitigation, ang ginagawa niya is to reduce the level of severity of the event or disaster. The next step, the fourth step, is the response. Response, ito yung kapag na-mitigate na yung isang disaster, ano yung mga alternatives or mga pwedeng gawin na substitute during the event. The last and final step is recovery. Ito yung kung paano nga ba magre-recover yung isang transport capacity after the disaster. In terms of the recovery of a specific area or country after a disaster, nakadepende doon sa availability of capital, equipment, and also the managerial expertise. Lastly, pag-usapan naman natin ang transportation resilience. One of the core aspects of mitigating transportation disasters concerns the resilience of transport systems, which is having infrastructures and modes able to withstand and recover from natural and anthropogenic hazards. So, sabi natin sa definition ng resilience, it is the ability to recover from a disruptive event. So, we have 4 strategies na pwedeng gamitin as a recovery after an event. The first one, monitoring and assessment. Ang ginagawa dito sa monitoring and assessment is obviously, minomonitor, ina-assess, inaalam kung ano, saan, paano, ilan yung naging epekto ng disaster sa transportation system. Specifically, anong lugar or saang lugar nasira yung mga daan, ilan yung nasirang daan or tulay, or ilan yung nag-shutdown at ports or airports. The second strategy is support for the impacted population. So, dahil nga naapektuhan, nasira yung mga infrastructures, syempre maapektuhan din yung mga passenger transportation, especially for commuting. Ngayon, nagkakaroon ng mga difficulties sa access ng mga transportation system. So, ang dapat gawin is to support the impacted population, such as, so paano nga ba tutulungan yung mga impacted population? Siyempre, pwedeng gumawa ng mga short-term alternatives, like pagkakaroon ng mga libreng sakay, libreng gasolina, mga free shuttles, lalo na dun sa mga passengers na kailangan ng transport system. The third one is the removal of discretionary demand. So dito, So ito naman pinag-uusapan yung demand and supply. So dahil nga nagkaroon ng damage yung mga infrastructure systems, transportation system, nagkakaroon ng insufficient access dun sa mga transportation system, which leads to nagiging mas mataas yung demand kaysa sa supply. And kapag mas mataas yung demand sa supply, itinataas yung mga presyo o yung mga fares. Ngayon, anong dapat gawin para matulungan man lang yung mga affected population? So, dapat i-remove yung mga discretionary demand. The last one is the modal shift. Dahil nga naging insufficient yung access dun sa mga, naging limited, restricted, or insufficient yung access dun sa mga transportation system, so dapat yung mga tao, private or public people, magkaroon ng modal shift or yung maghanap ng mga alternatives na pwedeng gawin or pwedeng i-access in terms of transportation. So, ang example nga nito, if kunyari, yung pupuntahan mo is, so example nga nito is, kunyari, sasakay ka sa isang airplane, nag-shutdown yung airport, so hanap ka ng ibang alternative or ibang mode of transportation. Pwedeng sumakay ka sa ferries, pwede namang by land.
Good day, I am Kimberly Tablang and I am going to report the future transportation systems. Transportation changes are either incremental or revolutionary. The future of transportation will be influenced by a higher integration between physical and information systems. Under future transportation system are past trends and uncertain future. Next is automation and information technologies. Third one is alternative modes and fuels. And the last one is the drivers of change. Let us tackle about the past trends and uncertain future. Throughout human history, ang transportasyon ay nananatiling limitado in scale and scope. In 2 centuries, since the introduction of mechanized transportation, ang kapasidad, bilis, kahusayan at geographical na saklaw ng mga sistema ng transportasyon ay bumuti ng husto. The goal of past trends and uncertain future ay ilipat ang mga pasahero at kargamento ng mas mabilis sa mas maraming dami ng ligtas at mahusay ay nananatiling pangunahing motibasyon upang mapabuti ang teknolohiya ng transportasyon. Modes, terminals, and networks alike have been subjected to remarkable changes that come into 2 functional aspects. The first one is revolutionary changes and incremental or evolutionary changes. Let us now proceed to revolutionary change. When we say revolutionary changes, it is concerned to an entirely new technology that creates new markets and growth opportunities for transportation and the economy. It marks the obsolescence or pagiging luma ng isang existing transport mode as the new mode has a substantial cost, capacity, or time benefits. Revolutionary changes tend to be rare but profound since they commonly involve the settings of entirely new networks. Kadalasan ay hindi mahuhulaan ang mga pagbabagong ito, ngunit posibleng masuri ang kanilang mga potensyal na epekto kapag nangyari ang mga ito. Gayunpaman, sa unang bahagi ng kanilang pagpapakilala, ang potensyal ng pagbabago ay maaaring labis na labis. Maaari itong humantong sa labis na pamumuhunan sa mga teknolohiya na may limitadong potensyal sa merkado at kakayahang kumita. Next is incremental or evolutionary changes. When we say incremental or evolutionary changes, it is concerned with the stepwise improvement of existing transport technology and operations. This leads to increases in productivity with more capacity, lower cost, and better performance of the involved mode or terminal. The incremental changes ay maaaring resulta ng mas mahusay na pagganap ng isang infrastruktura at mga sasakyan o ang paggamit ng mga information technologies upang pamahalaan ng mga operasyon ng mas epektibo. Incremental changes are possible to extrapolate, but the rate of change they bring is difficult to assess. Considering the two changes, the following observations can be made. The first one is each mode, due to its geographical and technical specifications, was characterized by different technologies and different rates of innovation and diffusion. A transport innovation can thus be an additive or competitive force and destructive force. When we say additive or competitive force, it is where a new technology expands or makes an existing mode more efficient and competitive. When we say destructive force, it is when a new technology marks the obsolescence and the demise of an existing mode and its business model. Still, in many cases, an older technology will endure because of its broad level of adoption, utilization, and accumulated capital investments or even regulations. This is commonly known as path dependency. Vested interest is in an existing mode, particularly if publicly owned, may also delay or even prevent innovation from taking place. The second observation is that technological innovation was linked to faster and more efficient transport systems. This process implied a space-time convergence where a greater amount of space could be exchanged for a lesser amount of time. The comparative advantages of space could thus be more efficiently used. The last observation is that technological innovation in the transport sector has been linked with the paces of the economic development of the world economy. Transportation and economic development are consequently interlinked, as one cannot occur without the other. Any technological change within the transport sector is linked with new economic and social opportunities. The prediction of future outcomes must consider what is within the realm of the following. The first one is forecasting, scenario building, and speculation. When we say forecasting, it is commonly using a trend of past observations and trying to infer this trend into the future. It assumes that the parameters related to an outcome remain constant and such that its extrapolation is a relatively simple exercise using time series methods. Example, moving average and compounded annual growth. These models also express uncertainty as growing confidence intervals. Once uncertainty reaches a level which is higher than predictability, forecasting cases to be a relevant exercise which requires scenario building. Depending on the level of predictability of what is being forecasted, or some trends are more volatile than others, a time frame of 5 years is usually considered within the realm of reasonable forecasting. In addition, forecasting is subjected to biases that can under or overestimate trends. The next one is scenario building. It tries to predict future outcomes by changing an array of parameters, with each change part of a specific scenario. A common strategy is to present the future within the realm of low, medium, and high growth scenarios and apply these scenarios of forecasting by changing the annual growth rate. Scenario building does not remove uncertainty but may improve predictability by considering a set of possibilities. There is no formal time frame for scenario building, but 10 to 15 years can be considered acceptable. The last one is speculations. At some point, the level of uncertainty is such that any prediction enters the realm of speculation. Quantitative methods lose much of their relevance, and under some circumstances, the future must be seen mainly as a speculative exercise about what may or may not take place. A common problem is that forecasting often makes predictions within a speculative time frame using a quantitative methodology to claim a high level of predictability while the predictability is very low. Any forecast looking at more than 10 years into the future should be considered as a speculation. Presented below are the common flaws in forecasting. Letter A is underestimation bias, letter B overestimation bias, and letter C is return to normal bias. When we say underestimation bias, these biases are common at the beginning of business cycles and are the outcomes of a lack of understanding of the growth potential, mostly because of uncertain market conditions. When the forecasting gap becomes too acute, congestion and capacity shortages take place. New forecasting attempts are usually made, which often leads to an overestimation bias. Next one is overestimation bias. The overestimation bias is usually the most far-reaching in consequence since it often leads to an overinvestment in capacity. It is supported by the enthusiastic perception by managers and planners that future outcomes and growth are highly positive.
The last one is return to normal bias. On occasion, forecasts are made in a low growth context but assuming a growth trend that took place during peak growth. Such an approach is more a cognitive dissonance issue with a refusal to see the new context because it is contradictory to institutional or stakeholders' interest. Let us now proceed to the automation and information technologies. Since the introduction of commercial jet planes, high-speed train networks, and the containers in the late 1960s, no significant technological change has impacted passengers and freight transport systems, at least from a paradigm shift perspective. The early 21st century is an era of car and truck dependency, which tends to constrain the development of alternative modes of transportation. A new paradigm shift is emerging, which will likely trigger the most important technological transition in transportation since the introduction of the automobile. ULTRA, or Urban Light Transport System. ULTRA is an automated light transit system, a form of rapid transit composed of small vehicles of a maximum of 4 passengers. It operates on its own guideway, which can be elevated at ground level. The system is accessible through a set of stations, which are offline, involving that loading and unloading have no impact on the flow of other vehicles, unlike a subway or LTR. The major difference of ULTRA to the regular system of transit, it is on-demand, semi-private, and nagsiservisyo lamang ito sa hinihiling na destinasyon. It also offers the potential of flexibility and privacy na karaniwang kulang sa mass transit system. Next is the diffusion of key port terminal automation technologies. The main types of container port terminal automation in terms of their current level of diffusion include: first one is automated decision making or yard management. It is account for the earliest implementation of automation since they improve terminal managerial aspects and the performance of existing assets without automating them. This can involve berth planning, where vessels are more effectively assigned and scheduled to use docking and transloading capacity. It also includes stowage and yard planning are also of common use so that the loading and unloading sequence between the ship and the container yard is improved. This includes the stacking and distribution of containers in the storage yard. Examples, piles of imports and exports, and even for a specific ship. Another concern of automated decision-making is the inland predictability, where a terminal is further able to anticipate the volumes generated by importers and exporters in the terminals. It becomes possible to assess better the demand for the usage of the terminal's asset. Second one is automated gates. Container terminal gates involve several transactions and were thus among the earliest terminal assets to be automated. Automated gate systems are able to identify drivers, process bill of lading information electronically, scan and identify containers using optical character recognition or RFID, and direct drivers to a designed spot for loading or unloading a container. Appointment systems are also used to improve waiting times at terminals. Third one is the automated tracking and tracing. It focuses on a higher level of integration of the components of terminals operation, such as ships, cranes, containers, and yard equipment by accurately pinpointing their location within the terminal. Although global positioning systems can be used, the placement of reference nodes across the terminal provides a higher level of positioning accuracy. This technology enables more effective use of terminal equipment and faster storage and retrieval of containers. The fourth one is the automated yard cranes. Since the stacking of containers in a yard is an asset or intensive activity requiring the frequent movement of cranes, there is a high incentive to automate the process. Automated yard cranes or automated stacking cranes or ASC are able to store and retrieve containers along a stacking area automatically. Next is automated horizontal transport. It involves the use of automated guide vehicles or AGV such as automated straddle carriers to move containers within the terminal. The most common use involves the transfer of containers from the pierside crane operation to yard storage. This is a complex operation due to the high number of container moves, particularly in high throughout terminal. The last one is the automated quay cranes. Cranes are usually the most capital-intensive superstructure in a port terminal. The growing size of ships has placed pressure to improve ship-to-shore productivity, and automated quay cranes are starting to be introduced. They reduce cycle time, are able to handle up to 4 containers at once, and therefore increase the number of movements per hour. Probability of automation by occupation group, United States, 2018 to 2013. The probability of an occupation to be automated can be inferred from its level of dependency on 3 factors of human expertise: perception and manipulation, creative intelligence, and social intelligence. These tasks are usually complex and difficult to automate, so occupations that have a higher reliance level of any of them are less likely to be automated. Manufacturing, transportations, and logistics employment are among the occupational groups that have the highest probability for automation since many of the tasks are repetitive. For instance, truck drivers are a significant source of employment, but self-driving vehicles could curtail this employment in the coming years. Under automation and information technologies are on-demand mobility services and driverless or automated vehicles. When we say on-demand mobility services, it is emerging, creating a hybrid operational model between the taxi and the private vehicle. With information technologies, fleets of cars can be managed and leased in real time, resulting in fewer vehicles required to convey a similar level of mobility. In turn, less parking space is needed, improving congestion in high-density areas. The main factors behind this rise in productivity involve a more efficient matching technology between the driver and the passenger. The large scale of on-demand car services, restrictive taxi regulations, and flexible supply models coupled with yield management systems. This also changes the ownership structure of dominantly privately owned vehicles toward a leasing system. Next is driverless or automated vehicles, a further evolution of the integration of ICT into transportation. It also likely to improve the mobility of marginal groups, example, the elderly and people with disabilities. Still, in an urban setting, a large amount of safety factors to consider makes such implementation more of a social than a technical constraint. Improved navigation and coordination of vehicles can reduce congestion substantially, particularly when bottlenecks are created by driver behavior, example, sudden braking. Fewer accidents would be a substantial relief from the causes of congestion. There are other applications of automation technology, particularly in air transportation, which would raise many safety considerations. Therefore, remote-controlled airplanes are more likely to be initially applied to air cargo operations. Still, as importantly, they would enable more efficient use of vehicle assets. With fewer accidents, the social cost of using the automobile would drop as well as insurance rates. Security standards could even change since driverless vehicles are less prone to accidents, implying that vehicle would be built with less physical safety features and less weight. Since fewer parking spaces may be required, this could free a substantial amount of road space and land that could be converted to other uses. This raises the question of the role of mass transit in a context where users could have access to mobility almost on demand. This question is of relevance since many transit systems are heavily subsidized and their ridership either is stable or in decline. Many gains remain to be achieved through the better management of existing infrastructures and vehicles. Yet, the diffusion of ICT is influenced by the business models of the transport sector in which it takes place. Forces shaping the diffusion of information and communication technologies in freight transportation. The first one is path dependency, next is asymmetry, and the last one is internalization. Considering the two changes, the following observations can be made. The first one is each mode, due to its geographical and technical specifications, was characterized by different technologies and different rates of innovation and diffusion. A transport innovation can thus be an additive or competitive force and destructive force. When we say additive or competitive force, it is where a new technology expands or makes an existing mode more efficient and competitive. When we say destructive force, it is when a new technology marks the obsolescence and the demise of an existing mode and its business model. Still, in many cases, an older technology will endure because of its broad level of adoption, utilization, and accumulated capital investments or even regulations. This is commonly known as path dependency. Vested interest is in an existing mode, particularly if publicly owned, may also delay or even prevent innovation from taking place. The second observation is that technological innovation was linked to faster and more efficient transport systems. This process implied a space-time convergence where a greater amount of space could be exchanged for a lesser amount of time. The comparative advantages of space could thus be more efficiently used. The last observation is that technological innovation in the transport sector has been linked with the paces of the economic development of the world economy. Transportation and economic development are consequently interlinked as one cannot occur without the other. Any technological change within the transport sector is linked with new economic.
Alternative modes and fuels. There are a range of modes that could replace but more likely complement existing modes, particularly for the transportation of passengers. Magnetic levitation, or short form maglev. Which advantage of having no friction except air friction, enabling to reach the operational speed of 500 to 600 km per hour. The higher speeds are possible if the trains circulating in low pressure tube. So, sabi dito sa maglev, it kaya nilang tumakbo ng 500 to 600 km. So, kung isipin natin, napakatulin nito kung meron din tayo dito sa Pilipinas. So imagine natin kung order tayo ng isang parcel from Visayas to Luzon, or from North Luzon to Southern Luzon. So it's take about mo to 1 hour, or 1 hour and 30 minutes, with a distance of 400 kilometers. Kung magiging 500 to 600 kilometer yung takbo ng train na to. So dito, sa pagpa-operate nito, ang ginagamit nilang force is yung magnetic force, na yung paggamit nila yung pagre-repel, and yung opposite poles na nagpo-pull and nagre-repel para mapatakbo nila yung train na to. So dito, hindi na nga siya wala siyang contact dahil parang nakalutang na siya dahil nire-repel ng train ng magnet yung mismong train. So no friction, mas mabilis yung pagta-travel. And yung kauna-unahang commercial large scale na using magnetic levitation is sa Shanghai noong 2003. Yung operational speed nila is umabot ng 440 km per hour. So matulin pa rin. So ito yung kadalasan, ito rin yung mga tinatawag na bullet train. So until now, gumagana pa rin yung tinayo nilang magnetic levitation sa Shanghai, na may estimated length na 30 kilometers. So kaso nga lang, ang problema dito, hindi na siya magaanong profitable kasi nga sa train, malulugi talaga siya kung ganun lang kaigsi yung tatakbuhin and ganun katulin. So sa operational pa lang, parang malulugi na siya. And kung hindi naman din ganun ka lakas yung demand, or hindi ganun kadami yung tumatangkilik sa ganitong transportation. So guide tube concept. So it involves capsule circulating in partially deflationary tube using an electric induction engine dubbed as hyperloop. So itong tube na to, tinatawag din siyang hyperloop. So kadalasan natin to makikita sa mga bullet train. So may mga tube siya, at ino-operate din siya ng electric kasi kung gagamit siya ng fuels or combustion engines at nasa loob siya ng tube, parang hindi naman practical kasi yung usok na ilalabas nun is may ipon sa loob ng tube. And kung walang ventilation yung tube na yun, maaaring possible na magka-zero visibility habang umaandar yung train na nasa loob. And magkakasyon ng pangingitim sa loob kasi may ilalabas na smoke. So next, alternative fuels. Mainly concerned in existing mode, but the sources of fuels or engine technology are modified. For instance, hybrid vehicle involve the use of two types of motor technologies, commonly an internal combustion engines and an electric motor. So familiar naman tayo dito sa dalawang types ng motor technologies natin, is yung matagal na natin ginagamit na combustion engines, and yung bago pa lang natin ginagamit ngayon is yung electrical motor engines. So other example pa ng alternative fuels is yung mga natural gas, mga biofuels, ethanol, methanol, mga ganun. So, alam naman natin itong dalawa na to. Yung combustion engines is gumagamit ng fuel or pwede din alternative fuels, and yung electric motor na gumagamit ng electricity. So, electric car engines. Electrical vehicles are less mechanically complex since they have fewer moving parts, no internal combustion engine and transmission, and a longer life cycle. So, sabi dito, less less mechanically complex since, since they have a fewer moving parts. So, bakit nila sinabi na less mechanically complex? Kasi kung talagang i-research natin, yung parts ng electric engines is less talaga sa mga combustion engines. Let's say for example, sa mga motor na ginagamit natin, sa mga parts pa lang nun, yung simula sa carburetor, sa makina niya, sa mga makina niya, sobrang daming mga gears sa loob nun, and may tinatawag pa silang mga piston chamber, mga ganun, mga valves, kung familiar kayo. Then sa mga electric car naman, wala na siyang mga ganun kasi hindi naman siya gumagamit ng combustion technology. Ang meron na lang yung mga electric engine is yung dynamo or yung pinaka machine na nagpapatakbo sa kanya na gumagamit ng electricity para mapaandar. And yun nga, yung electric car, wala na rin siyang transmission kasi kung mapapansin niyo yung mga e-bike natin dito sa Pilipinas, parang na siyang automatic. I-rev mo na lang yung accelerator niya, tapos tatakbo na siya. Unlike sa mga motor, kailangan pa natin siyang kambyuhan bago siya umandar. So, electricity supply. So, electricity supply, one of the electric vehicle can easily double the power consumption of a single residence, and as one more electricity vehicle are introduced and upgrade on residential wiring and local distribution grid will be necessary. So, siyempre kung gagamit tayo ng mga electrical engine, dodoble talaga yung pag-consume natin ng electricity kasi ang kino-consume ng electric car is electricity. So, pag may gumagamit na tayong mga electric car, kailangan din natin ng mas maraming electric supply. So, para din maging successful yung paggamit natin ito. Kasi for example, na low-bat yung ating sinasakyan na electric engine, so kailangan natin mag-charge, and kung walang magiging available na electric supply or parang gasoline station or recharging station, parang hindi na magiging practical na bumili pa or gumamit pa ng mga electric engines kung wala din naman palang mapagcha-charge yan. So kailangan kailangan din natin magdagdag ng mga recharging station, or kailangan mas madoble pa natin yung production ng electricity kasi kung ngayon pa lang nasa-short na tayo sa electricity katulad ng malawakang brownout, mga ganun. So hindi din natin masasabi na magiging successful yung electric engine na yan. So next, fuel cells. A fuel cell is use chemical energy of hydrogen and other fuels to cleanly and efficiently produce electricity. It involves an electric generator using catalytic conversion of hydrogen and oxygen. So ito namang fuel cells na to, isa rin siyang type ng alternative fuels. So gumagamit siya ng hydrogen and oxygen para makapag-produce ng isang electric. And dito sa new materials can be implemented on both vehicles and infrastructure. So, by the term insert niya, new materials, so, yun, mga bagong materials na pwede nating gamitin. So, ngayon naman, marami ng mga bagong materials na lumalabas. Katulad ng mga alternative fuels. Let's say, for example, yung mga biofuels, mga mga ethanol, ganun, alcohol, pwede natin silang gamitin as alternative fuels na para mapaandar natin yung mga sasakyan natin. Or sa infrastructure naman, pwede tayong gumamit ng mga ibang materials, let's say for beam, imbes na gumamit tayo ng reinforced concrete beam, gumagamit na lang tayo ng tie beam. So, yun yung mga type ng yung materials na ini-implement natin para mas makakadali yung ating mga ginagawa. So, dito naman sa new generation of dirigibles, ibig sabihin nito is to transport mostly freight in areas difficult of access. So, dito, ginagamit ito yung pagta-transport natin ng mga goods or modes ng transportation para makapunta sa mga mahihirap mapuntahan na lugar. Let's say for example sa pag worldwide, yung isa pa natin sa Arctic. Siyempre, konti lang din naman nakakapunta doon or hindi naman konti, pero isa yan sa mga mahirap puntahan na lugar kasi sobrang layo, tsaka yung iba yung klima nila doon. So, kung dito naman sa atin, ito naman yung mga liblib na lugar, mga dulo ng bulubundukin, mga ganun, sobrang layo na yung halos wala ng kalsadang madaanan. So, yun yung tawag doon, yung new generation of dirigibles. Driver change. Through recent history, there are few, if any, cases where our revolutionary transport technology was outcome of a public endeavor. So, through history nga, marami na nagbago sa transport system natin. So, kung dati, yung kalsada natin, ang purpose lang dati niyan is for military and transferring goods. Ngayon, ginagamit na rin natin siya para mapag-transport and mapabilis yung pagta-transport natin or pagta-travel. So, marami na nga rin nagbago yung simula sa mode of transportation natin, yung dating kabayo, naging may kalesa, naging may sasakyan. So, hanggang naging modern na, hanggang nagkaroon na ng mga modern sasakyan at ngayon yung pinaka latest na technology ngayon is yung mga Tesla. So, future transportation system also is facing growing concern related to energy, the environment, and safety and security. So, sa future transport system, dito, kino-concern na natin yung mga factor na dapat natin consider o makaka-affect sa atin. Siyempre, unang-una dun, yung energy, yung environment. So, ano ba energy? Siyempre, kung gagamit tayo ng mga electric car, sapat ba yung energy natin o sapat ba yung electric supply natin para masustain yung ganong mode of transportation? Susunod yung environment. Hindi ba magsasuffer yung environment sa panibagong transportation? So, alam naman natin do sa combustion engine, nagsuffer ng malala yung environment natin, dahil yung transportation isa sa factor ng global warming dahil sa ini-emit nitong gas. And next, yung safety. Gaano ba sa mga riders natin? And yung security, importante pa rin yung security natin. Kung magiging safe ba yung mga gamit natin. Or yung mga mahalagang bagay natin na iniingatan. Automation and new factoring process are impact supply chains and their geographical characteristics. So, dito naman sa automation and yung manufacturing process, dito naman yung paggagawa natin ng mga vehicles and pag-manufacture natin ng mga bagay-bagay. So, dito, pag-manufacture natin ng mga, let's say for example, ng Tesla. So, syempre, iba yung pag-manufacture niya sa old na sasakyan. Siyempre, kung nagmamanufacture tayo, mas gusto natin, gumagawa, ini-innovate natin or mas ini-improve natin yung isang bagay para naman mas bago tingnan and mas efficient siya. So, yan. So, globalization and regionalization. So, globalization, assume affordable energy prices, growing accessibility, and an enduring openness to trade. So, dito sa globalization, na-assume dito na mas maabot kayo yung mga price kasi nga globalization mas pangkalahatan yung presyo. Na-assume nila na lahat ng makaka-afford ng product nila. And yung growing accessibility, syempre, kung lahat makaka-afford ng lahat, pwedeng mag-grow yung economic nila. And kung mag-grow yun, magkakaroon ng malaking factor yun sa pag-unlad ng economic nila or ng transportation. And dito, syempre, kung globalization, ma-open tayo sa trade. Kasi dito, papasok na yung pag-import-export ng mga ganong bagay. So, sa regionalization naman, assume higher price and commercial environment is more prone to protectionism. All of which convey more friction to long-distance interaction. So, dito naman sa regionalization, assume daw natin na mas mataas yung price. So, bakit? Kumbaga, yung regionalization is yung pagpaprice natin sa locals. Kasi, consider natin, kung tayo lang meron nito, let's say for example, kung sa isang lugar, tayo lang meron ganitong product, siyempre, tataas yung demand. And, tsaka pag mataas yung demand, pwede din natin taasan yung value nito. So, doon pa lang, tataas na yung price ng isang product and wala namang magagawa yung mga customer. So, papayag na lang silang ganun sa price. And, dito nga, meron din sinasabi na long distance interaction. So, dito, hindi naman direktang halos nag-uusap yung mga tao. So, status quo bias. So, where the dominant strategy of public agency is to maintain existing condition. So, yung meaning ng status quo bias sa English is refers to our preference to leave things the way they are over changing them. So, madaling salita, kung ano yung meron tayo, doon na lang tayo nag-i-stick. Then, parang parang nag-came up doon yung pagkakaroon ng regulation. Then, na nagpe-prevent sa pagkakaroon ng technological innovation. And yung positive impact nun is yung pagkakaroon natin ng fundamental components of future transportation system. Yes, and yung parang yun rin yung naging way para magkaroon tayo ng improvement at ma-adapt natin yung changes sa market ng transportation. Next, new transportation technologies are becoming increasingly complex and governments are often in the position of having budgetary constraints and lack of the capabilities to implement them directly. So, sa new transportation technologies nga, siyempre, mas nagiging bago o nagiging high-tech isang bagay, mas humihirap siya. And yung government niya, hindi naman kayang i-manage lahat ng transportation sa atin. Say for example, dito sa atin, yung ginawang Skyway, hindi naman kakayanin ng government na ipatayo yun. Siyempre, limited lang din yung kanilang budget and limited lang din yung mga tauhan na mag-manage nun. So, ginawa nila, nakipag-partner sila sa mga private sector. Yun nga is yung San Miguel Corporation para mapagawa yung Skyway na yun na napapakinabangan na ngayon ng mga gumagamit ng mga sasakyan. para mapabilis yung transportation natin. So, yun yung best example nun kasi hindi naman forget gobyerno, kaya na nila lahat i-manage. Siyempre, may limitation din sila at hindi din naman nila kaya lahat, hindi naman talaga nila kaya lahat i-manage. So, driver of change for future transportation. So, dito naman, ito yung mga factor na makaka-affect sa transport system. First, yung policy. Pumapasok na dito yung governance, security and regulators, and taxation. So, dito sa transport system, siyempre, kailangan governance para magkaroon ng maayos na flow or may ayos natin yung paggalaw or pag-develop natin sa transport system natin. And yung security, siyempre, kailangan din natin yung security kasi hindi naman natin ma-assure na safe like na walang mangyayari sa daan. Siyempre, kailangan pa rin natin ng security doon. Halimbawa, nagkaroon ng carnapping, ganun. Doon na papasok yung security and regulation and taxation. Siyempre, kailangan din natin ng dito tayo kumukuha ng pang-maintenance ng ating mga daan. Dahil sa mga expressway, kailangan natin ng mga toll gates, and dito sa regulation, siyempre, pinoprotektan, nililimit din natin yung mga sasakyan na dumadaan para hindi rin naman ganun ka-volume or hindi ganun mahirapan yung kalsada na mag-lead sa pagkasira ng kalsada. So, kung papansin nyo, di ba, yung mga truck, may oras lang sila ng pagbiyahe. Siyempre, parang hindi naman din sila makadagdag sa traffic kasi ang lalaki nila na large scale volume naman kasi sila. So, next is yung finance. So, pumapasok dito yung finance mechanism, pricing and returns, public and private partnership. So, dito nga, yung mga financial support kung yung mga i-invest natin, babalik ba? Or bumabalik ba, and yung pagpapart kung may mga gagawin tayong project, kung di kaya ng government i-provide yung budget na yan, kailangan natin makipag-partner sa mga private sector para mapunan natin yung pagkakulang sa budget na yan. So, dito sa finance mechanism, so dito pinaplano natin yung pagbabudget natin para hindi naman tayo ma-short or may ayos natin yung plano and hindi mapunta sa wala yung mga budget natin. So, next is yung economics. Papasok dito economic growth, global trade, economic integration, transport cost. So, dito naman sa economic, siyempre, unang dyan, economic growth. Siyempre, isang malaking factor yung economic growth. So, kung ma-healthy yung economic natin, maraming business, so maraming gagamit ng kalsada, magkakaroon tayo ng maraming budget kasi pwede natin silang taxan. And pag healthy nga yung natin, yung economics, makakapag tayo ng magandang budget and may improve pa natin to. Tapos papasok din yung ganun din yung global trade, economic integration and transportation cost. Siyempre, dito naman sa transportation cost, dito naman mapasok yung pamasahe natin, kung gaano kamahal o kamura yung pagko-commute or pagpunta natin sa isang lugar, o kunyari sa magko-commute papuntang Maynila to Cabanatuan, gaano kamahal yung abutin ng pamasahe. Or kung sasakay naman tayo sa private vehicle, gano'n din kamahal yung gagastusin natin from Manila to Cabanatuan City. So, next, demography and society. So, dito yung population growth, aging/retirement, urbanization, changing work patterns. So, siyempre, kabari pa rin siya sa transport system. So, yung population growth, siyempre, kung lumalaki na yung population natin, marami lang gagamit ng kalsada. o kung madami ng gagamit ng kalsada, baka mag-cause to ng traffic, and baka need na natin mag-improve ng kalsada natin o kailangan natin siyang laparan para maka-accommodate natin yung volume ng traffic. So, next is yung aging and retirement. So, yun lang. Siyempre, pag tumatanda or nagre-retire, nababawasan din yung sa transport system. So, kung malaki yung factor ng aging and retirement sa transport system, magkakaroon ng problema. And sa urbanization. So, sa urbanization naman, ito naman is talaga itong nangyayari. Siyempre, hindi naman panghabang buhay na hindi madedevelop yung mga lugar, lalo sa mga probinsya, kasi mas na-focus tayo ngayon sa economic development. So yung urbanization is talagang bumibilis compare sa dati, dahil ngayon mas na yung tao, mas marami ng opportunity, so mabilis yung urbanization natin ngayon. And dito naman sa may changing of work pattern. So dito, for example, kung yung karaniwan sa lugar nyo is maaga pumapasok, tapos biglang nagbago, biglang naging night shift naman sila, so makaka-apekto din yun sa transport system. Baka biglang minsan traffic sa umaga, tapos biglang nawala ng traffic sa umaga, naging traffic naman sa gabi. So yun. Next, energy and environment. So dito nga papasok natin dito yung energy availability, alternative fuels, climate changes. So dito na explain natin to yung alternative fuels. And yung sa energy availability naman natin, siyempre ang pinaka dito yung ating electricity. Siyempre yung electricity natin hindi naman ganoon kataas yung supply, kasi minsan nawawalan pa tayo ng kuryente ng matagalan, especially sa gawing NCR, lalo pag nag-shutdown yung Malampaya power plant. So marami na apektuhan nun. So and yung climate change, siyempre pag pabago-bago yung panahon, minsan mainit or minsan may season na sobrang init, and may season na sobrang tagal ng tag-ulan. So ma-apekto rin talaga ito sa transport system natin. Next, the last one natin is yung technology. Information technologies, materials technology, and engine technology. So ito, siyempre sa makabagong panahon niya, mas nagpo-focus na tayo sa technology. So yung information technology, kung paano tayo nakapag-communicate. So kung dati gumagamit pa tayo ng mga mails or mga sulat, na dagdag pa yun sa transportation, ngayon pwede na tayong gumamit na through messenger or via online na lang. So mas mabilis and mas mabilis yung reply or yung response ng kausap mo. Kasi yung material technology, siyempre mas na-improve natin yung material, unlike dati na from clay to cement. So na-improve natin, mas magiging magagawa natin yung matibay at easy to apply. Ganun. And sa engine technology, yun nga, kung dati sa train natin, gumagamit tayo ng cooling or coal para ma-operate natin yung engine. Ngayon, gumagamit rin tayo ng electricity para ma-operate natin yung train, na malaking kabawasan sa climate change natin or sa global warming.